I mean, admittedly, there's just a lot going on site, right? And they have a lot of workers, and sometimes you get like the A team, and sometimes it's the B team, and it's just helpful, I think, overall for quality assurance sort of site visit to happen more regularly.
Airtightness is good, but we are not trying to enforce, we're not never going to get to zero air leakage. You're always going to have air leakage. Even through your best efforts, as tight as you want to get it, you're always going to have air leakage. To address hey, we don't want sick building syndrome, which was around like 10 years ago as a big thing, or maybe longer than that.
Well, we're back for the next episode, and I want to welcome Jeff and Stefanie. Thank you, Stefanie, for setting this up. And Stefanie and I know each other for a few years working alongside one another on projects in New York City. So really, I have a bunch of kind of topics and questions I want to ask for this episode. But to start, it would be really interesting to hear how your experience has been going from New York, which is becoming a more and more stringent market, to Texas, which I've had differing experience in.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very fair assessment. So I am the director of operations for the Enclosures team in Texas, and we do work all over Texas. It's certainly come with some surprises for me. There's just a different expectation, let's say, as far as how many site visits are required. I'm used to going, in New York City twice a week was normal. Now it's like once a month. So it's definitely less stringent, and we do find just the usual issues, but we don't get to keep tabs on it quite as strictly as we did in New York. So it's been a big difference for us.
Is enclosure consulting welcomed by owners, or do you typically find yourself contracted by designers or the design team or the owners?
It's typically through the design team. And interesting, another actual switch for me was, so we have projects where we're under the design team, part of that side of the table. I've also now have a number of projects where we're actually hired by the GC for their risk mitigation. So it'll be, let's say, our competitor with the design team, and then I'm on the other side of the table trying to protect the GC. And ultimately, it comes down to the same level of collaboration and constructability reviews, but it does put a little twist on it for sure.
So I did a tour of our factory this morning with a facade consultant, and I want to pose this question to Jeff to get your initial thought on the question. But he came in and he basically asked, and this is such a vast question that you don't even know where to start. But how do I know where to, or how to identify where leaks are coming from or what's causing system failures? And the conversation evolved to get to the design and manufacturing side of components and then the installation side of components. So if you had to attribute a percentage of failures that maybe you could identify as a system fault versus installation or site fault, how would you kind of divvy up those two issues that come up over time?
Just thinking about it practically based on experience, and take these numbers with a grain of salt. It's not like I'm looking at a spreadsheet that has the numbers out there. I would probably put installation is 80 to 85% of the time. That's the bigger problem with the unitized systems, whatever system, pre-manufactured assemblies, whatever you want to put it. It's a broad topic, but with the level of quality control that the controlled environment those systems are put in place, installed, what have you, the quality issues generally go down. I'm not going to be break anyone's brain when I say this. Problems arise at interfaces. When we have to install one interface next to another, window has to touch an opaque wall, roof has to touch a wall, something like that. Those are the bigger issues. And just, installing, I'm just going to stay with windows for now, but installing window properly, it's harder to do that in the field when you're 6 stories up and it's 30-mile-an-hour winds and it's 20 degrees outside. You're more likely to have problems there. So that's where we see most of the shortcomings or failures, I'd say. Again, to kind of put it in a loop, 85% of failures, however you want to define that, are usually installation related, in my opinion.
You're in Colorado, right?
Yes.
So I'm guessing you experience more temperature deltas or more extreme weather conditions than Texas, although that might, maybe Stefanie will argue. But do you find that the climate zones with more extreme sort of differentials or deltas have more stringent codes, which in turn make the market more sophisticated, which in turn leads to higher quality or higher skilled contractors or laborers?
I would say no as a simple answer. And the reason I say that, I mean, ICC has the climate zones, Colorado and the Denver area is climate zone 5. Yeah, we get probably massive temperature swings, being in the kind of continental area where it's 60 degrees one day and the next day it could literally be -10. That happens all the time. But climate zone 5, and we share with a lot of other parts of the US. In Denver, it's very, very dry. Like we are in a high desert, and people kind of think, if you don't from the area, that everything's mountains, it's snowy all the time, but dry desert environment where we get rain, we get snow, but everything dries so quickly. So the risk profile of Denver, where it's not humid, but it is climate zone 5, is very different than, I'm looking at a map, but somewhere in the Midwest, the Northeast, I think Connecticut has a lot of climate zone 5. I'm from there originally, but they have a lot more humid climates, and the ability of things for dry out is much, much less than Colorado, where, I don't want water in my building, period. But if it does happen, like, well, it's so dry, it'll just dry out. That happens a lot more. So I don't think the risk profile is the same based on, where you are climate wise. I guess I'm saying that while I'm talking about difference in relative humidity, but ICC, which drives all insulation requirements and, what kind of testing, well, not what kind of testing you need, but insulation requirements, it doesn't really differentiate too much across one climate zone between humid and very humid. There's dry and moist. I think it's A and B for particular climate zones, but I don't think it's well captured for all the various local climates we have across the US.
And so, Stefanie, do you think with the special inspection requirements in New York, do you think you have a more scrutinizing eye on site, or do you think that in turn leads to a higher end product, or do you think that's just sort of become the complacent norm in New York, and you don't really see as much of a delta in other markets?
Oh, I definitely think that as soon as we go on site and put our name to a report, we're going to take it seriously, right? So being able to do so more regularly helps the overall end quality product for sure. It's not that they don't respect our input, but admittedly, there's just a lot going on site, right? And they have a lot of workers, and sometimes you get like the A team, and sometimes it's the B team, and it's just helpful, I think, overall for quality assurance sort of site visit to happen more regularly. And some client typologies, like hospitals, certainly have us coming more often. Multifamily project, maybe not as much.
And so if you get involved in a multifamily type of project where it's completely cost driven or budget driven, and they'll only have you on site once a month with a limited scope, would that turn you off from that type of client or project?
No, I think it makes us lean more into like the pre-install meetings where we try to rally the team, make everybody understand why we're here and what we're trying to do, and get them to be on our side. And if we can convince the GC to walk with us so that they develop a better eye for it and keep their crew accountable, that'll also help. But no, ultimately, I want better buildings, so I'm not turning those away.
When you're having those conversations, though, and I acknowledge that sometimes you're hired by GCs or designers, and there's different motives or incentives there. For the owners that you're speaking with, what do they ultimately care about? Sometimes I think the message gets a little convoluted when it's going through a general contractor, and so it becomes a game of telephone. But
right.
I guess the owners that you're speaking with, what's at the forefront today?
Risk mitigation. The building envelope is the most litigated part of our industry, right? I think it's, oh man, there are some statistics, but it's like, was it 69 billion annually it's thereabouts, right? Like this is where the lawsuits happen. So if we can help make sure that you don't have a leaky building, that's what everybody wants. And I think that awareness is there. We're not telling them anything new. We're just reinforcing the scary message.
Well, I think leaks are very apparent, especially in condo buildings, and people hear about that and they get all freaked out. But I obviously saw your video or post about air leakage, and it seems like that's coming to the forefront, given people understand the energy cost or implications about having a building that lacks air tightness or has a lot of air exfiltration or infiltration. So how do you educate people on that, or get garner more interest or attention to that, to something that people otherwise would have primarily neglected?
Yeah, I think that one is a lot harder. You're right. People don't understand it. They don't quite, follow the code updates the way that, of course, we have to when we're responsible for that project. It does take a lot of lunch and learn presentations also, right? I'm just telling them that this is now the reality. These are the different things. And we do find that If an architect doesn't have a facade consultant on board, they will put a requirement into the project specifications, but they might be a little bit all over the place regarding what the actual required performance is. There's a difference if you're using the ASTM E779 versus the US Army Corps of Engineering requirement. There's a different level that is expected. And if you mix those, and we find out during CA when we're coming to test, it just gets very tricky. So this is actually where Jeff has immense experience with the US ACE, which happily I haven't gotten to do yet. I think he has great experience on. The ASTM E779 is where we see a lot of in Texas so far.
Well, as a national practicing firm and operating in a lot of different markets that have not only different code requirements, but just different norms or standards of building, does that become tough for you guys to try to maintain probably some sense of continuity throughout offices, yet acknowledge, like, look, I got to put my different hat on now that I'm in Denver versus New York versus Texas?
I would say yes. I mean, in regards to the codes and what's required, and I'll just kind of focus on the air leakage stuff. It's the word of the day, if I'm going to use that stupid term, is confusion. Like, there's so many different standards and so many different requirements out there for air leakage. Recent example I can just give just to show how this gets confusion. 2021 ICC has air leakage requirements. A town in Colorado, well, it likely has air leakage requirements as another topic, but for the purpose of this conversation, it has air leakage testing as a requirement. A municipality in Colorado, they amended the code, they adopted 2021 ICC, amended the code to take out that air leakage testing. However, they also said we want to follow the Zero Energy Ready Home initiative from the Department of Energy. Okay, if you're following that, that has its own air leakage requirements. So they amended the air leakage requirements out of ICC, but then they added it back into through accepting DERH. So no one has a great picture, even us who are in it all the time, like what exactly is required and where it is required. I mean, I can track it down, but in most of the time I can answer off the top of my head, but all these different municipalities and codes and authorities having jurisdictions, they're very different, many different ways to implement airtightness and how it's required, whether you're going to put it in project specifications, whether you're going to reference code, whether you're going to reference the energy ready homes, passive house. There's just a lot of different codes and standards out there that say one way or the other, you should probably do air leakage testing or blower door testing, whatever you want to call it. So there's just a lot of conflicting sources out there where you can get this information and get this as a requirement. So it becomes very confusing for anyone who's not in it day to day. And even when you're in it day to day, it's still like, what am I looking at? Let me go read the code for literally the 200th time to make sure I understand it. So it happens all the time.
If somebody hears, and to try to eliminate some of that confusion, if someone hears a watertight envelope or assembly, they just want to think in a heavy rainstorm, forget testing for a second. When they're living day to day, they're not going to see leaking. But
yeah,
how do you explain to somebody an airtight building? Because in turn, you don't want the building to be too airtight to eliminate not having enough natural ventilation.
Yeah, the first thing I always caution is like airtightness is good, but we are not trying to enforce, or we're never going to get to zero air leakage. They're always going to have air leakage. Even through your best efforts, as tight as you want to get it, you're always going to have air leakage. To address the, hey, we don't want sick building syndrome, which went around like 10 years ago as a big thing, or maybe longer than that. I'll borrow a phrase from, I think it was Seabrook or someone, just build tight, ventilate right? You want to make your envelope as tight as possible and get natural ventilation through the mechanical system. So for the air leakage portion,
say that again. It was
sorry.
Good.
Build tight, ventilate right.
No, it's good. Build tight and ventilate right.
Yeah,
so you want to build tight, and you said get your ventilation through your mechanical system. So you don't think through operable windows.
You can definitely account for operable windows, but you have to have operable windows. There's people who rely on operable windows and they don't put operable windows in the building. So it's like, oh, I'm going to get my ventilation through there. Like, how? The thing doesn't open. So you need to design for the ventilation. And the thing with operable windows, you want to overcome, I'm going to just say the human factor, right? Like, if I just had ventilation through my windows, I have to rely on my occupants to open the windows. That's a terrible idea. The same reason you have like condensation resistance. You try to rely on, I'm just going to go with the analogy because it's easy. Like for condensation resistance, you're assuming that somebody's going to have in a small apartment 17 plants with 6 animals running around while they're boiling pasta and the shower's on. You're just trying to assume for the worst case scenario of that human factor. So you can do that to a degree with condensation resistance, but I wouldn't rely on that for airtightness. So if I'm building tight and ventilating right, I'm making my envelope as tight as I can make it while making sure that my mechanical system brings in the outside air that it needs.
Well, so what's probably abnormal for us, or what I'm finding now is in New York, 5% of the floor area has to be naturally ventilated, typically through operables. So the norm in every building is to have operable windows. And then Stephanie, you go to Texas and it's rare. I'm doing a multifamily project in Dallas, all fixed windows. So was that a strange adjustment for you?
To a certain degree, yes, but also, I mean, right now the weather in Texas is beautiful. Ask me again in 2 months. Like, I am German. I like opening my windows, but in the summer I will not. It's humid at 80 degrees in the morning. That's awful. And then during the day it's 100 degrees and too hot, right? So there are 3 months in the summer that I just don't touch my windows. And yes, they're operable, but I don't want what it has, right? So I understand why those would be just fixed. And those do have a better performance, right, as far as air and water infiltration. That's nice.
Where do you see, and I think Austin was a quick city to come up. It's kind of thought of as an all glass city. You have a lot of unitized curtain wall, or for people that don't have an eye for it, just a lot of glassy buildings. Do you see that changing now? And also in Denver, I mean, sometimes I think about sort of how intentional the skyline or the city, the design of the buildings is versus just who's the local contractor available to deliver these buildings at that particular point in time.
And it's interesting. I do think architects are shifting away from the all glassy towers just because it's harder to distinguish yourself. When it's a sea of glassy towers, how do you make yours stand out? That's purely design based, so not something I can talk about extensively. I think there is a sea of towers, but Austin, I believe, has 20% of its commercial office space empty, so they're not building a lot right now of those. It's really shifted more to the housing issue that we have.
Do you see any of these around the country, these office to residential conversions? I mean, I can't even begin to describe how many there are in New York. And then we look around and it's like, why are other cities not adopting this as quickly?
There's conversations about it for sure, but we're probably not quite as far as New York is on that topic.
Yeah, I would echo the same in Denver. We just feel theorize about it, but I haven't seen it yet. So I think there's more space. There's other kind of, we can spread out a little more. Where I think obviously New York is a little more condensed and harder to kind of find space.
What is, and I can't speak a lot on Denver because I maybe have only been once, but I don't know much about the market, but it's thought of as to be a super high end market, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely in the past couple of years, like any other city, depending where you go, you're going to, and you get farther away. It's kind of can change a little bit, but there is a lot of high end construction, I think, and I am not, super expert on this. The recent, in the last 2 years, the affordable housing laws that were adopted have kind of made it so there's not as many high end, but that is just what I hear in rumors. So I wouldn't take that as absolute truth. But yeah, there are. If you're in the this core of the city or some of the new fancy neighborhoods, Rhino, whatever, and I'm probably out of date saying that because I'm old now, but they do get a lot more kind of high end, let's call it luxury apartments. Not as many condos for other reasons, but you do get some kind of high end apartments here and there.
Well, yeah, I think in the Walnut area, there was a couple New York developers looking to build over there. And I do wonder what it must be like for developers in other cities coming to hot areas like Denver and Austin, wanting to build a certain way and then getting the wake up call of saying, well, wait a minute, that's not how we do things here.
Yeah, I think in terms of like high end and cost, it's a little different. Not how we do things here. I've run into more in ideas and designs like, hey, we have a low slope roof and we're going to ventilate it. Like, what? Wait, what are you doing? We do not do that here. We do not do that here. Or we want to use built up roof or mod bit roof, which are great, but we just do not see it here that often. I mean, it's a good system, which is somebody wants to use it. Like, wait, what are you doing? Do you know how to do that? Are you certified to do that? So there's a lot of questions and just those local practices, which in various parts of the country reign. But yeah, we definitely get that here where developers come in like, oh, I don't know why you're trying to do that. We would never try to do that.
So how often are you guys, how much time do you each spend in call it upfront in manufacturing facilities, whether it's various opaque components or unitized or glazed assemblies, seeing developers wanting to try out new either curtain wall, window wall, or window manufacturers and relying on you guys to go sort of vet them out?
Again, not as much as in New York, but it is.
I mean, that's normal here for them to say, I want to work with someone in Romania, facade consultant, go for your $5,000 visit and put yourself up in a hotel and tell me what you find.
Yeah, I in Colorado at least, I can think of the times, not Romania, but a handful of times where I've gone to a company's manufacturing site and seen like how they're putting stuff together, but it's very rare. I mean, people are trying new things, obviously, otherwise we'd be building the same buildings we were building 30 years ago, but it's just based on research or test reports. People are just kind of accepting like, hey, let's use this, but not consultant. Go out there and look at their site and make sure it's good. Like, that just doesn't happen that frequently out here. So at least with us. Maybe I'm completely wrong and other companies do it all the time, but we don't do it that often.
I think it's, yeah, there's certain markets. I mean, in the smaller sector markets, I don't think you see it as much. They have their select few contractors that they work with over and over again. Maybe I'm just accustomed to it in New York because so many people want to have their little piece of the pie, and so you'll see the entire world trying to compete here. But I guess from your standpoint, other than having input on those early key design development or schematic meetings, where do you guys wish you spent a little bit more time in terms of the life cycle of early concept to project closeout, even to, I don't know how much of like litigation and leak investigation that you guys do? Like, do you find the leak investigation or investigative forensic side of the business fun, or is it like, I wish I could be here from day one and avoid some of these issues?
I personally don't think they're fun because they're always so contentious. I prefer the new design world because we're all happily collaborating, building a new project. Just the energy for it is nicer. We do have a whole forensics team, and I've gotten involved in some of those projects when they're local. It does, let's say, give me new material to tell clients this is why you need to work with us, because I will help you not be that guy. And it does happen all the time. And let's say some of the aging buildings from the 80s around Austin, we have a lot of work through those. And it's just, what needs to be done because people live in those and we don't want their balconies to collapse, for example. And water will find a way. And we've removed cladding and found that this wooden column holding up the stair was like halfway gone, be it through insects finding it or just water damage. But there's certainly, the climate is not kind to some of the materials around here.
And what about you, Jeff?
Pretty much the same thought. I mean, I don't mind the forensic part of it, but it does get contentious very quick when it goes into litigation. I don't think anyone likes that. When it's a job we're not on, it's nice to be like, yeah, you did this. We found this. You should have done this, 2 years ago. But yeah, those aren't as fun. I do prefer the front end consulting. Like, hey, we've seen this on other projects. Here's why you shouldn't do X, Y, or Z, or here's why you should do this. So that is where we like to spend more time. In terms of getting in on a project, I can speak for Lerch Bates and what we've seen. I think for a lot of projects, we get in a little later than we'd like, but maybe everyone says that. I mean, I'd like to be more involved in schematic design, which everyone defines differently, but when you're selecting materials, we often are on a project after maybe it hasn't explicitly been approved, but the concept is pretty much, hey, we want this type of air and weather barrier, we want this type of cladding. Like those decisions have been made. Maybe the thing that needs to change when we get in is like, well, maybe we'll use a different manufacturer, but they know what they want to use at that point. So it's nice to be able to weigh in on that and talk, well, have you thought about compatibility? We thought about, when you're going to install this, the weather limitations. But for most of our projects, when we're working with designers, I feel like we're in, Stefanie, please jump in if I'm wrong, or Texas has it different. Like we get in around DDs. SDs is pretty rare when I think we're on a project.
I think, Stefanie, your experience was probably a little different in New York, I would think, right? When they're like, do we want some type of opaque clad or curtain wall, window wall, mega panel? What are the pros and cons? Do you think this kind of thought around if all four elevations look the same, then it's probably not intentional design in terms of maximizing performance, although that's not realistic. But were you accustomed to having some of those earlier discussions?
In New York City, always. I think, most projects it's a much smaller involvement, but concept phase, we were, talking to the architect already, definitely schematic design and onward. Here in Texas, of the, let's say, almost 20 projects I'm working on, 3 of them are where we started in schematic, but that's larger national architecture firms. So maybe they're used to working with facade consultants in that way, but more locally, it is typically the end of DD where they think of us and we start having some input. So yeah, very different. I have one project right now in Texas with black insulated metal panel. I mean, it just hurts my soul because it's a horrific idea, right? I mean, just, black gets hot, right? And trying to make sure that we don't melt what's inside. I mean, it's just, I wish I'd been involved, in concept there.
What's one area where, if you look back to a lot of the early unitized curtain wall systems where there was limited, if not any access to maintain the system over time, like your chicken head gasket and your splice joint seals once you installed. And obviously we're kicking ourselves now looking back on how that was designed. What's one area or one thing that we're doing today that you think in 30 years we're going to be kicking ourselves saying, how the hell were we building like that?
That's an interesting question. Jeff, do you have a quick answer? I want to think for a second.
Yeah, but how many people do I want to alienate here?
Just to throw out some topics, if you want to think about it, people talk about recyclability a lot, or embodied carbon, or how much waste there is on site. I don't know if that sparks any thoughts.
I was going more product specific, but I'll say insulation as air and weather barrier, I think is pretty risky, especially when you're not putting something airtight behind it. I think from many years from now, we may be opening up some of those walls and seeing, hey, we have condensation or something going on in our joints, because interior air, you can move all the way to those joints, since yes, they're only sealed on the outside. So insulation acting as air and weather barrier, I think, while it's good and kind of speeds up the process and building of a building, it's repetitive, but I'm not sure how durable.
Do you mean
those
spray or
systems are gonna
mineral
be.
wool?
I'm talking when you
or.
have rigid board insulation and you seal the joints, and like that is my air and weather barrier. That is everything. See it a lot. It can work. I just don't know. I haven't done any dramatic studies. Like, what's the long-term implications of that wall? How's it going to look 30 years from now? I don't know. And people can do, the accelerated weathering tests, all this stuff, but that doesn't tell you like 30 years real time what that wall looks like. So I just don't know if we're going to be using that, or if we're going to be kicking ourselves.
You'll be the
30,
old guy
50 years
ripping
down the
apart
road.
the wall one day looking.
Yeah, like, oh, yeah, it's going to be, it's this system. Great. Well, we know what we're dealing with here. This is garbage, but hopefully I'm wrong and it's great. And 30 years from now, you open it up. You never open it up because there's never a problem. It's still there. But that would be my best guess right now.
Fingers crossed. So I would, having thought about it, say resilience. I mean, we're just not building particularly robust. I mean, building to meet code means you've built the worst building you're allowed to build, which sounds harsh, right? But that is the baseline. And just a couple of weeks ago, there were really strong winds in Dallas, and so many roofs just got their TPO ripped off. So we know that the climate is probably not going to get milder. So what are we doing to make sure that what we invest so much in with our buildings is more resilient?
And do you think it caught some type of like dramatic climate crisis is required, like, I don't know, the hurricanes in Florida, or energy code or carbon crisis in New York, or bird friendly glazing, or all these things where like it required some type of dramatic event to wake everybody up and say like, all right, we need to change the code today?
That's tricky. I think some of those dramatic events are already happening, and people are just kind of ducking their heads, hoping it doesn't hit them personally. But yes, I do think as we will continue having stronger winds, hotter summers, we're going to think more about, shading our windows so that we don't even have the sun hitting them, right? Like that's a really easy louver that you can integrate, and don't see much of that. In a very hot climate, I'm surprised at how many super flush facades you have, when really if you could just stick some louvers in front of it, you'd be shading a glass and not building up as much heat.
Yep. Well, I really appreciate both of you guys coming on. It was good to hear the different perspectives, and I love the content that the company and everybody seems to gather together on the content that you guys put out. So one of the few envelope consultants that do it. So keep it up. And again, thank you both for coming on.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Appreciate you inviting us.
Sure. Take care, Jeff.